I'm Charles Wolfe. I am a retired UCC minister who retired in Prescott and serves as church clerk of this congregation. Our interim pastor is she in the room? Did she leave? She's out here. She'll be walking through in any moment. Kathy Gibson Christensen, who has been with us for about a year and a half now. I want to welcome all of you to this evening's event as we focus and think together about the doctrine of discovery. And I confess that despite many years of education in Wisconsin, through college, and a number of years beyond college in Chicago, I had never heard of the doctrine of discovery until a few years ago, when it was called to my attention by a man named Larry Littlegeorge, who is a member of the Ho-Chunk congregation of the United Church of Christ in Black River Falls. And it was that congregation which, with considerable passion, brought to the board of directors of the Wisconsin Conference of the United Church of Christ a proposal that a resolution be passed by the United Church of Christ in Wisconsin to disavow the doctrine of discovery as one antithetical to Christian morality and faith. That resolution is going to be voted on at the annual meeting of the Wisconsin Conference of the United Church of Christ this year. And this evening's gathering is one intended to provide opportunity for each of us to learn more about and give some thought to what this has meant and how you and I can make some transformations in the way that we think, perhaps, and maybe even lead the larger community and the wider society to make some adjustments, maybe even corrections in the way that we all think and how we choose to relate to one another in healthier and more just ways. I am glad for your presence with us as we gather, and I am pleased to welcome Jeff Ryan. And I thank him for his willingness to lead us through this evening. Mr. Ryan is one of a number of treasures which have been revealed to me in my 8 years of retirement in Prescott. He is a native of Frederick, Wisconsin, where he grew up on land stolen from the Ojibwa people, which is of course true also of Pierce County. I'm not sure where his interest in First Nation people began, but he has become a student of Native American culture and has developed relationships with a number of Indian elders, most notably those on the Lac du Flambeau Reservation, where for the past 20 years he has been arranging opportunities for Prescott High School students and Prescott townsfolk to go to the reservation for several days to listen and learn from our First Nation brothers and sisters. And over those 20 years, somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 Prescott people have spent time on that reservation. And there have also been a number of visits from elders, drummers, artists, people who have come from the Lac du Flambeau Reservation to Prescott. We have in Jeff, right here in Prescott, one of the premier non-Indian experts on Indian culture and history in our state, I believe. He is widely respected, among others, who teach First Nation history in high schools and colleges and universities in the state, perhaps as widely respected among other teachers as he is feared by other high school baseball coaches. He is now, or soon will be, I'm not sure which, inducted into the Wisconsin Athletic Hall of Fame for his exploits as a baseball coach. I am pleased and grateful to Mr. Ryan for putting together the information that he will share with us and leading us in thinking about this tragic part of our national history. I also want to thank Dallas Eggers for providing technical support which enables us to have the presentation up on the screen in front, and for Prescott Cable Television, who is up in the balcony recording what happens this evening so that it can be shown to everybody in the community, including those who are not able to be with us tonight. Thank you to each of you for coming this evening. And after we are done here at about 8:30, you are all invited to come downstairs for fellowship, where there is coffee, decaf mostly, lemonade, water, as well as some cookies and other desserty sorts of things, as well as opportunity to continue conversation with our neighbors and friends. So, Jeff, Ryan, thank you.
All right. Okay, I'm going to come down here. I got to have something in my hand while I'm talking. Okay, I'll try not to forward this, and I'm going to stay down here if that's okay, instead of being up on the stage. First of all, thank you, Mr. Wolf, for that nice introduction. I appreciate it, and I see a lot of current students, or a few current students, some former students, some future students, some current and former colleagues of mine, fellow educators. Mr. Hayes, good to see you, a person who, when I first started teaching 30 years ago, he was one of the people that I certainly was intimidated by when I first started walking the halls of Prescott High School. Not in a bad way, but I always had an enormous amount of respect for Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Linseth, too, Mr. Lubeck, a current teacher, and a former student of mine, Mrs. Eichmann, not Mrs. Eichmann anymore, Mrs. Langer, another former student. Again, I appreciate being the opportunity to share a few thoughts. And some of the students in here, like Grant in the back and Jack, some of the stuff might seem to be a little bit familiar, and I think that's a good thing. So I'll do the best that I can. And that's what I always ask my students to do. I always ask my kids to do the same thing. Do the best that you can. Always do the best that you can. So I will do that. And if I get a little excitable, I apologize. If I get too loud, I apologize. I'll try to remember that I have a microphone on. Okay? All right. Let me give a little bit of the backstory. If you didn't notice, I'm not native. Okay? Like many of you, we don't have, or we probably share one thing in common: we have very little, if any, native blood. So people always ask me, and rightfully so, where's the interest? Where do you get the interest in talking about, or learning about, or listening to others talk about Native people? It's a great question. And it's a long answer, but I'll give you the Reader's Digest abridged version of it. I grew up in Frederick, Wisconsin. Small community. I have a great affinity for that town still. I have my brothers, 3 of my brothers live in the area. Go back there quite often. Had great parents. There were 6 of us, 6 boys, and no sisters. Just 6 of us. So I have a younger twin brother. I always refer to him as the smart twin. I'm the dumb jock. I always tell people that. And I owe a lot to what I've been able to do to my parents. They're both gone. My dad grew up in Minneapolis, moved to Grantsburg. He was a baker. He was a factory worker in a canning factory. Then he became a school custodian. My mom was a school cook. Very humble people. Had a great life, great parents. And one other person I want to mention is my oldest brother Stuart, who passed away in 1995. He had Down syndrome. And I always say to people when I talk to groups, when I talk about my family, I always say that my brother Stuart, and I think my brothers would agree with me, defined us as a family. And I don't know if anybody knows anybody with Down syndrome. I remember one time I went and I saw a comedian who was talking about his brother having Down syndrome. And he told a lot of good jokes about, the joys of having a sibling with Down syndrome. And then he said this. He said, you know what? If everybody in the world had Down syndrome, there'd be no war. Nobody would be poor. Nobody would be homeless. I'm like, who's got the disability there? It makes me think about that. And I think that's true. So when we talk about me and my family, I think one of the things my parents ingrained in me was the feeling of empathy. Empathy is not easy. I think empathy is a very, very difficult emotion. Sympathy is too easy. My dad did not like sympathy. Anybody can feel sorry for anybody else. That's easy. But to be empathetic, to feel empathy, that takes work, it takes thinking, and that's good. So much of this presentation, I would argue, is about empathy and understanding that emotion and how powerful it is. It's a very, very powerful emotion to be able to feel empathetic. And I think that's a good thing. I think if we felt that way more often, things would be a lot better. And before we start here, I want to say one more thing. I have this, I do have some cards, business cards my wife got for me a few years ago for Christmas. And on the card, I have this statement on it. It says, every person I meet is in some way my superior. And that is absolutely true. So you're here, I'm humbled, and I'm thankful that you're here listening to me. I can learn just as much, if not more, from you. And I think if we look at others that way, I think that also would be a positive thing. Every person I meet is in some way my superior. All right, the Doctrine of Discovery. I'm going to talk about some things that might be viewed as being a little bit controversial. Some of the images you see might be a little bit unsettling. And I'm going to challenge your thinking, okay? And much of what I'm going to share is connected to my upbringing and my relationship with Native people, okay? Now, how many people remember back in the 1980s, late 1980s, 1990s, during the whole treaty rights, boat landing protests up in northern Wisconsin? Anybody remember that stuff? Okay, some of the older people. I shouldn't say older people. More experienced people, sorry. Remember those times. Remember those times. And, I too was there. I mean, that was happening. That was history what was happening. When I had Mr. Lubick in the classroom, that was going on. And about 2 or 3 years previous to that landing business starting, my brother John and my brother Greg played on a local baseball team called the McKinley Braves. And the Braves were St. Croix tribal members, the St. Croix band of the Ojibwa. And everybody on the team was Native except for my brothers. They asked, a gentleman by the name of Cootie Bearhart Jr. asked my brother John, hey, he got to meet him up at UW Superior, would you be interested in playing baseball at the McKinley Braves? And John said, yeah. And he said, my brother Greg might want to play too. So they started playing for the Braves. And every Saturday afternoon at 1 o'clock, my brother John, brother Greg, and my mom and dad, me, my twin brother, my brother Stuart, we'd go to the McKinley Braves baseball games. And there usually would be about 400 or 500 people that would follow the Braves. If there was 400, that meant that 393 were tribal members and 7 were not. And that was the Ryan family. And I think that was a great experience. I think it's good to experience that. And so when that boat landing stuff happened, and when people were being treated the way they were being treated, I didn't really know a whole lot about what was going on. I was in the process of trying to learn. But But I do know this. You don't treat people like that. These weren't tribal members. These were friends of ours. These were friends of ours that were being threatened. Rocks were being thrown at them. Awful, awful things were going on at those landings. So for me and for my family, these are friends of ours. So that's kind of how I got involved. This first slide I'm going to show you. On the left-hand side, that sign, that was taken at Butternut Lake in Luck, Wisconsin, 6 miles from my hometown. That drawing there, that was drawn by a 4th grade student in an elementary classroom in Minocqua, Wisconsin. An art project. You can draw whatever you want to draw. And a 4-year-old boy drew that. And the 4-year-old boy, of course, was not native. That was his project. Okay? You say, what does this have to do with the Doctrine of Discovery? It's got everything to do with it. Okay? Now, getting a little bit wonky here. I apologize for this. Pope Alexander VI. I'm not going to read slides to you. But in the 15th century, early 16th century, late 15th century, we know is the beginning of the age of exploration. We know about all the explorers, De Soto, Columbus, Balboa, all these people who go west, who go into the unknown, looking to discover new lands. Now, when those lands were discovered, now what? The lands were discovered, now what? Well, the Pope issued 2 orders and said, basically, and again, I'm trying to make this as basic as possible, it's okay for explorers from Spain and Portugal to claim the land as theirs. It's now Spanish territory. It's now Portuguese territory. That direction came from the Pope, not from government, from the Pope. So it becomes the stamp of approval, the pass to claim lands in the New World. Okay? And this is the guy who issues that proclamation. First one called the Papal Bull, the Intercera. Again, I'm not going to read the slide to you, but this is the guy that basically creates the justification for the claiming of indigenous lands in the West. Well, the Pope says, we got 2 groups here. We got the Spanish and the Portuguese, and they're both Catholic. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically divide the world into 2. Spain can claim half, the Portuguese can claim the other half. Wherever the Portuguese land, that's Portuguese territory. Wherever the Spanish land, that's the Spanish territory. And all governments accepted that. And again, this all comes from the Pope. You say, well, hey, I'm not Catholic. We have the Reformation, of course, but other countries follow. We have the Netherlands. We have the French. We have the British, who use the same philosophy to claim such colonies in the New World. So the Christian church remains consistent in that the doctrine of discovery does not just apply to those Christian churches before the Reformation, but after as well. Okay, and it goes back to, how can you claim something is yours? How can you claim something is discovered when there's already people there? Well, it's a great question. Does anybody know the answer? That's not a rhetorical question. Anybody know the answer? You can. Oh, you certainly can, because the Pope said you can. Some people would say today you shouldn't be able to, but the Pope and the Christian church said you can. Does anybody know why? It's because they weren't people. They weren't people. Which meant that they were not what? They were not Christian. And if you are not Christian, you're not a human being. You're not a person. You're not a thinking, rational human being. Therefore, since you're dealing with animals, again, remember now, this is the Christian church. It begins to justify behaviors that I don't think in 2019 too many people would give a thumbs up to. And it really is divided into three. And again, this is what justifies the events that, or the things that happen to Native people in the West. Enslavement. I want to read to you, I apologize, I don't have this on the slide, but I do want to read something to you quickly. A papal bull empowered by the church says this: explorers in the West have the power to, quote, invade, vanquish, and subdue all pagans and enemies of Christ, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to take away all of their possessions and property. That's an order from the Christian church. Remarkable. So it's okay to enslave, because again, these are not people. They're not people. Secondly, extraction removal. We've all heard stories about, maybe we're familiar with the Trail of Tears, and we've heard about that, and we've heard about Indian removal. And what I find really, really interesting about students' knowledge of the Trail of Tears, where the tribes of the Southeast were forced to march west, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, and the Creek. And a lot of people are unaware that Wisconsin had its own death march. Most people are unaware of that. And I find that very interesting, that we are not aware of that story. When we talk about removal, you can remove people, again, if they're viewed as animals. They have no right to own the land. Animals can't own the land. They happen to be on it. They are occupiers. That's all they are. Indigenous people, Native people, they are occupiers of the land. They are not owners, so they can be moved. And then extinction and extermination, and this is obviously very tragic, and there's been a lot of studies that have been done, of course. There's a lot of people have estimated that the number of people, indigenous people in the West, numbered anywhere from 20 to 40 million. In North America, about 18, 19, 20 million. And by the turn of the century, 1900, there are 225,000 left. Remarkable. When we think of the word extinction, we do not associate that word with people. But again, remember, in the eyes of the Christian church, we're not talking about people. So, those are the results of the doctrine of discovery. Again, it justifies the subjugation, the enslavement, the removal of native people, not just in North America, but in Central America, the Caribbean, and throughout South America. Does that make sense? Not that it makes sense, but do you understand kind of the basics? The basics. And again, remember, it comes from the Pope, from the Catholic Church, but then it is endorsed and it is embraced by the Christian church after the Reformation as a means to, again, justify the expansion of empire. Okay? Everybody with me? I hope. Nobody has any questions? All right.
Actually,
yep, go ahead.
Did the Pope feel pressure from the monarchies at that time?
That's a great question. The answer is monarchies communicated with the church and sought counsel. So the church then provided that counsel. It's a great question. Great question. Yeah, thank you for asking it. Yeah.
On the slide about the Pope, it was basically saying the numbers like said basically 11 or 12. Is that how many years he was Pope?
Yep. Good question. Yep.
For that extraction in Wisconsin, which path did they take down there? Has that not been documented?
Oh yeah. Take First Nations history or take my class, we talk about it. Okay? It's a long story. Are you a student here?
Middle school.
Okay, why don't you go to the Prescott High School website, find my email, send me your email, and I'll send you some information about it. You can read about it.
Okay.
Why don't you do that? Yep, a couple more, and I want to make sure I get, go ahead.
With the extraction in the Wisconsin area, do you know how many people were killed?
How many people died? About 600 on the death march. And it was all Ojibwa. Now, when we talk about extraction too, I want to say removal, that manifests itself in today too, because that removal continues to go on in Brazil. Indigenous people are being moved so they can get access to the resources in Suriname, in Guatemala. It's still going on. And it's certainly still going on in the United States. And that's important. Again, and we're going to talk about how the land, again, still today, really, Native people are still viewed in terms of federal Indian law as just occupiers of the land. Still are, yeah.
Maybe I'm conflating two separate periods of history, but wasn't part of the expansion also spreading the gospel
Sure.
to indigenous people? So if
Sure.
they were animals and non-people, how could they be saved?
Great question. Now, were there people that did endorse and accept Christianity? Yes. Most often, people never bothered to ask. But that certainly did happen. When we talk about post, say, 1800, where the missionary movement in the West becomes more commonplace.
Okay, so after the initial expansion, that's when the mission of the church.
Right, yes. But one would argue then the justification for conversion still is rooted in the doctrine of discovery. But yes, you're right. It's a good point. Yes, thank you. You've probably seen a map like this before. Take a look at the continental United States and see how Native people have lost land beginning in 1775 all the way to 1992. Just kind of a graphic to show how things have changed. Oh, wrong way. Okay, I want to talk about this. When I made the statement about federal Indian law still being rooted in the doctrine of discovery, there was a very, very famous Supreme Court case, Johnson versus Mcintosh, that basically the federal judiciary, Supreme Court said, basically in effect, that Native people don't own the land. They are occupiers of the land. And they occupy the land because we allow them to occupy it. And I always say this, I've been told this by many, many people, there really is no such thing as tribal land. Tribal land is tribal land because the federal government says it's tribal land. Tribes have sovereign rights because the federal government says they have sovereign rights. So when people talk about reservation land or tribal land, it really doesn't exist. It's the federal government that basically decides how many rights Native people have. Okay, and it goes back to if they're occupiers, and you might think, so then you're telling me the United States government is out of the goodness of their heart allowing them to practice their traditional ways or live on their reservations? The answer is yes. Charles, do you have a question?
Well, basically what you're saying is the government is saying to the Native peoples, you are sovereign because we say you're sovereign. If we say you're not sovereign, you won't be.
That's right. And that's exactly right. And there are more and more people in Indian country today that are biting their fingernails than ever before. I would say within the last 50 years, there's more and more people in Indian country today that are very nervous. Because, well, I won't get into that. But here, Johnson versus Mcintosh reinforces the idea that Native people, again, are not owners of the land. They're simply occupiers of the land. Yep.
What started the lawsuit?
It's a long story. I'll give you a simple answer. It involved a Native person attempting to sell land to a non-Native person.
All right.
Good question. Okay. I need 12 volunteers, but I'm going to give you a sheet of paper, but you can't turn it over. Okay? I got a space. Don't look at it. Don't look at it. Don't look at it. Cameron. I need a non-student or two as well. Right there. Okay. Let's see. This is butter. All right. Okay. Wait. Okay. Now, I'm going to ask you a word or give you a term, and I want you to tell me. I've used this before, and I think it's pretty effective. When I use the term commencement address, what comes to mind? Graduation. Graduation, okay? What would you say in a commencement address the message might be? What might be the message of a commencement address? Go ahead.
I'm happy to be looking towards the future.
Okay, looking toward the future, again, because the word commencement means start. Okay, good, excellent. What else might be the purpose of the message of a commencement address?
Advice.
Advice, excellent. Achievement. What else?
Goal setting.
Goal setting, you're dominating. Very good, goal setting. Anything else?
Thanking people for
Absolutely, being thankful, thanking people, recognizing those who helped you along the way. And would you say usually it's kind of a motivational type speech, tries to get someone excited or optimistic about the future? Would you agree with that? Everybody agree with that? Okay, I want you to those of you who have that sheet, I want you to turn that over. And I want you to read that to yourself. Okay, and I want a young person, please, to volunteer to read it. But I want you to read it good and loud. Go ahead.
The Indian is dead. Let all that is Indian in you die. You cannot become truly American citizens, industrious, intelligent, cultured, and civilized until the Indian within you is completely and absolutely dead.
Okay? I need someone else to read it. I need another person to read it. Read it, please.
The Indian is dead in you. Let all that is Indian within you die. You cannot become truly American citizens, industrious, intelligent, cultured, and civilized until the Indian within you is completely and absolutely dead.
That short phrase was retyped. Is there anything you notice? I'll put Ms. Langer on the spot. Anything you notice about the retyped words of that statement?
dead is in capital letters.
Okay, what do you think is inferred there when the word dead is in capital letters? This is a person giving a speech. I need someone else who hasn't participated here. Tell me who gave this commencement address. Who was the person who gave it? Jack, who was the person who gave it? Good and loud.
Reverend J.A.
Sound it out. Just go ahead and say it. Right. A reverend, right? Right? A Christian reverend, right? Sir, would you read it one more time? Really listen to this.
The Indian is dead in you. Let all that is Indian within you die. You cannot become truly American citizens, industrious, intelligent, cultured, and civilized until the Indian within you is completely and absolutely dead.
That's pretty good advice. Remarkable. You have a reverend, and he's not the only one, saying the only way that you, as a native person, can become successful, can become a citizen, is if you erase everything about you that is native. Remarkable.
He's also the Indian school. That's been not really said. He's a reverend, but he's at an Indian school.
He's at an Indian school. That's correct. And we know the Indian boarding school system, which I'm sure a lot of you perhaps are familiar with. You know, we have a school motto at our high school. Every year we have a different motto, and I'm kind of a motto person. That was the motto of the boarding school system. Kill the Indian, save the man. So you destroy the native. You completely eliminate it. And again, it's sort of like, the idea is that this is for your own good. And who you are, what you are, there's nothing redeeming about it. So there's no reason to hang on to it. Yeah?
Like Mr. Luke said, that it's at a school. Do you know if the school was just for like little kids?
No, it was, this school is at Carlisle Indian School, was identified as the, quote, Indian Harvard. And there were over 500 Indian boarding schools across the country. Carlisle happened to be the most respected of them. Some of the most famous graduates of Carlisle were Jim Thorpe, Charles Chief Bender. Others who attended there, who taught there, a woman by the name of Gertrude Bonin. You have a lot of people who attended that, again, supposed prestigious Indian school. But again, that's the motto. The only way that you can be successful is if everything about you that is native is eliminated. Okay? Again, Doctrine of Discovery. Wrong way. Whoa. Those are Lac du Flambeau students. In 1856, the state of Wisconsin passed a law that said native parents have no rights regarding their children's education. None. Which meant that state officials could take children from their homes and force them into boarding schools. Now again, that was true all over the country, but Wisconsin was in 1856. And the age range was typically from, say, 5 to 15. And a lot of these kids, they had no idea how old they were, so what they would do is kind of like, they'd have a measuring stick, kind of like they do at Valley Fair, to see if a kid was tall enough to go on the ride. And if a kid was tall enough, go to boarding school. And it is true. It is true that children would be taken from their homes at night. Why? Because that's when they're at home. They're in their beds. During the day, they're out playing. They're out running around, so they knew that they would be home. Again, the whole notion that being native, maintaining your cultural identity, is wrong. It destines you for failure. I'll go this way. Sorry. This is from a school superintendent, Indian school superintendent out in Kansas. Again, you can read it. The only alternative is left is civilization or annihilation, absorption, or extermination. Again, That's a school superintendent saying the only alternative is to change or exterminate. This picture is taken in the state of Washington. So you have a minister in the front. I don't know much about that Indian school up in Washington, but I do know this in Lac du Flambeau. The students in Lac du Flambeau, I'll show you a picture of that school in a second. Of course, Native people were not allowed to practice their native religion or their quote religion until 1978. Native people are the last group of people in the United States who enjoy freedom of religion. 1978. Now the kids think that's a long time ago. That's not that long ago. Okay? Lac du Flambeau, students had to go to a Christian church. And up in Lac du Flambeau, on the north side of Highway 47, is the Catholic Church. On the left side of Highway 47 is the Presbyterian Church. This is what they did to determine what church they went to. You go this way, you go this way. You go this way, you go this way. You go this way, you go this way. That's what they did in Flambeau. And required. Again, Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Savage and civilized cannot live and prosper in the same ground. One of the two must die. That's the boarding school before it was renovated. I'll show you the renovated picture here in a second. Mr. Linseth has been up there. It's certainly one of the parts of our 4-day trip that we spend up in Lac du Flambeau, but let me tell you a couple things about this place. There are Native people up in Lac du Flambeau who will not go into this building. They just will not. Because of the things that happened in that building, whether it be psychological abuse, physical abuse. They will not go in the building. When they renovated this building, they found toys in the walls. They found old school uniforms in the walls. And again, those who have been up to Lac du Flambeau, like Mr. Linseth, have seen those. And there's stories behind those toys, and there's stories behind all those trinkets that were hidden in those walls. But the remarkable thing about, and there were people up in Lac du Flambeau that wanted this building burned to the ground. They wanted it razed, they wanted it bulldozed. But the decision was made to renovate, and there it is. And the great thing now, I would argue, that building that was designed to destroy Native culture, that building now houses the Historic Preservation Office, and also it's the Language Center. They teach language classes there. So it's become a space that was used to destroy culture. Now it's become a space to celebrate, enhance, and try to revive it. Again, for us this past fall, during some inclement weather, we spent a lot of our time in that building. Did a lot of workshops, and there was a drum group who played for us in that building. It's just a great, great, great place. Question?
So what kind of role does it play now? Like a school?
Yep, there's classes, craft work. They have discussion groups, historic preservation.
Grades?
Excuse me?
Which grades?
For anybody who wants to go, it's usually, they'll have we have adult education classes here in Prescott. They teach education classes there too as well. It's again, you can go to their website. I'll send you that information too, and you can look at all the things that they do.
Yep.
Okay, question?
So basically the treatment of Native Americans would be comparable to the treatment of African Americans during the Civil War and Reconstruction and Jewish people during the Holocaust?
Certainly. It's a good analogy. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, I don't want to go to that yet. I want to go back. I don't want to go there. Must be going the wrong way. What's happening? No, going the wrong way. Really going the wrong way. I can't get back there. Okay, I want to tell one more story about this. I was at a conference in Wisconsin Dells about 10 years ago, and I listened to a Ho-Chunk tribal elder give a presentation. And he talked about the stories of the Ho-Chunk language. The term Winnebago used to be used in Wisconsin. Now they've gone to their traditional name, Ho-Chunk. I'll call on you in a second. Let me finish the story, then I'll go to your question, okay? And the story was that there were Ho-Chunk students during free time, during recess, who would go outside and climb trees. And I don't mean 10-foot trees, 15-foot trees. I mean, we're talking about trees 50, 60, 70 feet in the air. And the teachers and the superintendent's like, holy cow, look at those kids climbing up there on those trees. They're like monkeys up there. Man, they're just, wow. How spectacular that was. And then this gentleman said, he said, you know what they were, and when I tell the story, I always have to pause a little bit because it gives me the chills. And he says, you know why they climbed those trees? So they could speak their language without the people on the ground hearing them. Because if the people on the ground heard them, they'd be slapped, they'd be yelled at, they'd be admonished. I heard that story, I was like, holy cow. And he said, that's how the language survived. So when I meet somebody, whether they be Ho-Chunk, or Ojibwa, or Seminole, or Dakota, or Lakota, and they can speak their language, that's a miracle. That is an absolute miracle. So when we talk about cultural genocide, we're starting to make amends. That's one of the things I think that has happened in some parts of the country, where this recognition that the attacking of a culture is not really a good thing. A person asked me, not directly, but gives me an opportunity to talk about this, and it's a question a lot of people have. They say, what term do you use? Do you use Indian? Do you use Native American? Do you use American Indian? Actually, the answer is all of them are fine. And typically, what I've been told, now that's others telling me this, that's not me saying it, it's other Native people or Native people that tell me. Because they say, we understand context, and when someone uses the term Indian, he said, you can tell whether or not it's being used in an inappropriate way. But he said, a lot of people have told me that what's becoming more and more common is people are beginning to identify themselves by the language that they speak. For example, if someone's from France and you ask them, what are you? They say, I'm French. They don't say, I'm France. Napoleon said that. But you'll say, I'm French. If you're from Germany, what are you? Well, I'm German. Okay? With the Ojibwa is really the language that they speak. Ojibwa Moan is the language. So when people say, what are you? They will say, I'm Ojibwa. But the correct term that's being used more and more by the Ojibwa is the word Anishinaabe. Anishinaabe, which means first people. So the language of the Anishinaabe is Ojibwa. The word Ojibwa, sometimes the word Chippewa is used. Chippewa is the word that is used in treaty negotiations. I'll talk about that in 2 seconds. But the word Chippewa, Ojibwa, really means puckered moccasins. So the Anishinaabe were identified or being labeled by the kind of shoes that they wore. Well, that's not who we are. We are Anishinaabe. We are the first people. So that's why that word is starting to kind of disappear. You'll still hear it. But it doesn't really matter what word you use. You know, you're not going to get anybody, you're not going to end up with a mouthful of teeth if you call somebody Native American or American Indian. I did have one person, very, very fortunate. Maybe, has anybody ever heard of the name Vernon Bellecourt? American Indian Movement leader who passed away a couple of years ago. He actually spoke at Prescott High School 10 years ago. I'm just absolutely, I was so unbelievably thrilled to have a man of that stature and status in my classroom and speaking to students. And I asked him this very question, and I said, which did you prefer? I said, Anishinaabe, Ojibwa, Chippewa, and this is what he said to me, Vernon. That's what he said. That's what he said to me. That's what I prefer. So, treaty rights, okay? Treaty rights. The Ojibwa. We talked a little bit about the spearfishing situation in northern Wisconsin. And we talked about the ugliness associated with that chapter in Wisconsin history, which really, really was an ugly time for Wisconsin. We know that the U.S. government was interested in this region of what will become the United States, primarily because of the trees in northern Wisconsin. It was the trees, it was the pine that the federal government really wanted to get their hands on. And they approached the Ojibwa, not from a warlike stance, agreed to sit with representatives of the Ojibwa Nation or the Chippewa Nation, and that's important. The word nation is important. The nation of the Ojibwa. What makes a nation a nation? It has a government, it has a population, and it has boundaries. So when the U.S. government sat with the Ojibwa Nation, they negotiated these treaties. They wanted access to the land, they being the federal government. They wanted those trees. So the Ojibwa say, sure, you can use the trees. And there's other things that they negotiated for, but the big thing was they wanted the resources, they wanted the trees. Same thing in 1842. In each treaty, the Ojibwa said, you can use the trees, but we want to continue. I'll say that again, continue to hunt, fish, and gather on the land. The U.S. government said, sounds good to us. So what's important to understand is that the Ojibwa were not given the right to hunt, fish, and gather. They kept it. They never gave it up. Now, you history people, what happened in 1848?
Wisconsin became a state.
Wisconsin became a state. So the Treaty of 1854 changes things. There's a Treaty of 1854 for Wisconsin. You see it identified as Minnesota up there. Also, the Ojibwa up there were signatories to the treaties. The Treaty of 1854 in Wisconsin creates 4 reservations in Wisconsin. The Bad River Reservation, the Red Cliff Reservation, the Lac de Flambeau Reservation, and the Lac-Courte Reservation. But the Treaty of 1854, guess what the Ojibwa reserved again? The right to hunt, fish, and gather in the ceded territory. The U.S. government said, okay. Okay? But little by little, the state of Wisconsin begins to regulate the resources and then begins to pass laws that say, you know what? In order to harvest game, you've got to have a license. And they begin to pass laws and begin arresting Native people for legally fishing off the reservation, hunting in the ceded territory, those shaded areas. They were being arrested. You don't have a state license. We're going to arrest you. Well, I don't have any money. Well, then you're going to do 4 months in jail. We're going to take your boat from you. We're going to take your gun from you. That's what the state of Wisconsin started doing. And the state of Wisconsin said the only place that you can exercise your harvesting rights is on the res. That's it. Only on the reservation. Does it make sense? Well, two brothers from the Lakota Reservation, Fred and Mike Tribble, 1974, said, you know what? We're going to go off the reservation and we're going to spear through the ice. And we know what is going to happen. They were going to be what? Jack, what was going to happen to them? They were going to be arrested, and they were arrested. And Mike Tribble, who I know, reached in his back pocket and said, you can't arrest me. And he read the portion of the treaty that says, we reserve the right to hunt, fish, and gather in the ceded territory. The game warden said, doesn't matter to us, I'm writing you a citation. 9 years later, the Federal Court of Chicago said, State of Wisconsin, you're wrong. You've been denying the Ojibwa the right to hunt, fish, and gather in the ceded territory for years. And that was when I graduated from high school. And then in 1988, they began to go off the reservation and spear. And that's when the trouble started. People not having any sense of the treaty rights or where they came from. And that's really when I started to get involved. Okay? And there's a lot of information about this, but again, like I said, there's a way to disagree and there's a way not to disagree. You don't disagree like this. Spear this, that sign, that was in cars all over the place. That was in public libraries. That was in restaurants. That was all over the place. You know, I got involved in the issue, and I remember walking through my hometown of Frederick, and people would say all kinds of names. People would wave to me, but they only had one finger up. That happened a lot to me. My mom, the school cook, was being harassed. It was just really, really an ugly time. Really ugly time. And that's kind of how I got involved. You know, there's a way to disagree and there's a way not to disagree. And again, when you talk about the doctrine of discovery and you talk about what you can do to try to make amends, I think the most important thing is to understand. But to understand, again, like empathy, takes time. And a willingness to listen. You know, it's one of the things, and I'm very, very proud of the fact when I go up to Lac du Flambeau, it almost brings tears to my eyes when I say this, when we meet people up on Lac du Flambeau who say this to me. They say, you know what, we really appreciate you and all the people who have come up from Prescott to learn about us because you want to learn and you are willing to listen. Nobody wants to listen. And, you know, that's sad. But thank goodness there have been a lot of people in this community. I'm very, very fortunate to teach in this community. Very fortunate to have an administration that recognizes the importance of listening and recognizes that our diversity is a strength. Again, it's sad. Very sad. This is a big issue in Wisconsin. Again, it's directly connected to the doctrine of discovery. And a lot of you are familiar with my connection to this issue. And when we talk about the issue of Indian logos, it's a very complicated issue. And some people take this complicated issue and try to trivialize it. It's not. It's very complicated. And we talk about it in school. Talk about it on the reservation, talk about it at conferences I go to. It's a very complicated issue. And we certainly are connected to the issue. The students are, because we compete and we participate in a conference that uses Indian logos. And again, that's Chief Wahoo, and yes, the Cleveland Indians have said we're going to remove that from our uniforms, but we're still going to sell apparel with it on. You know, I've seen a lot of Native people. I've never seen a Native person look like that. You know, there is a double standard here. And I would argue it's an ugly one. There's a lot of work that's been done on the history of logos and where they come from. The one on the left we're familiar with, the Fighting Irish. And it's something that people speak to a lot when we talk about this issue. They say, well, if the Black Ox is wrong, if the Indians is wrong, then so is the Fighting Irish. Now, I will say this. I was taught by my parents that before you take something, you ask for permission. You don't just take something. Would you agree? You ask for permission. And if the person says no, then you don't take it. Okay? Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Anybody know where that university is? Anybody know the community or the city? South Bend, that's right, South Bend, Indiana. The university, what's the founding of the university is, what kind of university is it? It's a Catholic university. Many of the people in that community, those who founded it, were of what heritage, what ethnicity? Irish. Okay? And when they began to compete in interscholastic sports, or intercollegiate sports, I should say, hey, let's come up with a name. Let's call ourselves the Irish. The Fighting Irish. Leprechaun, I've never seen one. Okay? Mythical being. But again, I want to emphasize this. This is the Irish calling themselves the Irish. Vikings. One would connect those Norse people to what region of Europe? Scandinavian. I grew up in Frederick. The Frederick Vikings, and boy, there's a lot of Norwegians up there. Eriksson, Johnson, Peterson, Olsen. It's S-O-N, S-O-N, a few S-E-Ns, but it's almost all S-O-Ns. Norwegian, Norwegian, Norwegian. Okay? Frederick, primarily a Norwegian community. Hey, let's call ourselves the Vikings. That's important. Logos named after occupations. A lot of them Wisconsin. Ashland Ore Dockers, a great name. The Clintonville Truckers, awesome name. Anybody know where the truckers come from? Why they're called the truckers? Well, you know. Go ahead, Jack. Why are they called the truckers? During World War I, asked by the government to make trucks for the war effort. So they became the Clintonville Truckers. Do you remember the other school on Lake Michigan, Manitowoc? Remember what they're called, Jack? The Ships. That's correct. The same thing. So again, rooted in the history. Okay, Purdue Boilermakers, Mellon Granite Diggers. Great name. Why? An old granite quarry outside of the community. Okay? Purdue Boilermakers, Monroe Cheesemakers, a big cheese factory in Monroe. Oh, let's call ourselves the Cheesemakers. So we're talking about occupations here, people, right? Occupations.
And a lot of Swiss people.
That's right. That's right. What do you think of that name? The Chinks. The mighty Chinks. Pekin, Illinois. Oh, is that okay? Or is that wrong? That's wrong, but that's okay. You say, well, it's different. Is it? The Mighty Chinks, Pekin, Illinois. When the basketball team came out on the floor, the band would play the Asian riff. Ning-a-ning-a-ning-ning-ning-ning. That's what they did. I guess they were honoring Asian culture. They're no longer the Pekin Chinks because they identified that nickname and logo as being unbelievably inappropriate. Oh, I'm going around. So if we had logos like that, would those be okay? Oh, but those would be wrong? That was a homecoming float in 2014 in Oklahoma, a non-Indian school. Hey, Indians, get ready to leave in a trail of tears, round 2. That was a middle school float from a middle school in Indiana. Scalp the Indians. Isn't that cute? Oh, what's the big deal? You know, if we had a team called the Saints, I might get struck by lightning saying this one. Could maybe have the dance team could dance in, or could wear habits, and they could do their routine. What, they'd be honoring Catholics. And you say, well, that's different. Well, and I hate to say this, but I'm sure a lot of you, and I mean this, there are people in here who know the importance and understand the importance of eagle feathers and the sacredness of eagle feathers. And how eagle feathers, we know, can only be possessed legally by Native people, indigenous people. They have such important cultural significance, ceremonial significance for Native people. And when eagle feathers are used as mascots and logos, there are a few things that are more reprehensible to a lot of Native people than using eagle feathers in that way. And when I tell people that, what they mean, thankfully there are people that have said, wow, I didn't know that, I understand. You know, could you imagine? I think St. Joe's might have something to say about a team called the Saints, with maybe somebody dressed as a priest, and he could, spritz the crowd with holy water before the game. Any of you know Kitty Rhodes, the late Kitty Rhodes, our former state representative, really good friend of mine, Republican state representative from Hudson, spent a lot of time in my classroom, a person who I had an enormous amount of respect for, a person who was always willing to listen, always returned my phone calls, even if she didn't want to. She always did. And whenever she was campaigning in Prescott, she always stopped to see me. We talked a lot about this, and she wore a crucifix. She was a Catholic, and she had some Prescott students talk with her about this issue because she admittedly did not really understand what the issue was, and she was thankful to the Prescott students who kind of educated her on the issue of the logos, and Kitty Rhodes always said it was the students from Prescott that changed her mind. Because she said, if those feathers mean the same to Native people as this crucifix does to me, then it needs to stop. That's Kitty Rhodes. It takes a big person to change their mind. It's a courageous thing to do. Very courageous. And if a person doesn't change their mind, I would say it's almost as courageous for someone to say, wow, I understand. We had, and back in 2014, the picture's not there, 4 people come and speak at Prescott High School about the logo issue. One of them, Tom Sobieski, a farmer from Berlin, who wanted their school to change their logo, and when he wrote a couple letters, received harassing phone calls, harassing letters, dead animals were thrown in his front yard. Again, it's, there's a way to disagree and there's a way not to disagree. Again, Prescott students, despite the fact that perhaps there's people in the audience and people in the community think that I force this on the students, we certainly talk about the issue, and I certainly ask probing questions of them. They've never gotten a grade for this, but they've been involved in this issue for a long time. And again, the people of Lac du Flambeau go back to a willingness of people in the community of Prescott to listen and to have dialogue of what it means to be Native in the 21st century. Again, this was last year. Again, students wearing the shirts.
And some Native elders also.
Yep, had some people from Lac du Flambeau came down. I just put this picture in here. We had our 2018 trip to Lac du Flambeau, the summer trip, which anybody can go on. Trip is always the same weekend, the weekend after the 4th of July. You can see Marv somewhere in the picture, I think in the back there. We had 22 people there this past year. We've now had over 500 people from our community spend time up on the Lac du Flambeau Indian Reservation, meeting with tribal elders, learning about the culture. It's just a wonderful, wonderful time. And it's, I would say the best thing about my 30 years teaching has been my connection to Lac du Flambeau. These 3 gentlemen on the left is Brian Jackson. He is now on the board of directors of the National Indian Education Association. Good friend of mine from Lac du Flambeau. The guy in the center, Brandon Tomes, a tribal member who had repeatedly had his life threatened in the late 1980s and early 1990s during the spearing. Fish war, so to speak. And Tom Malson, the former tribal chairman or tribal president of Lac du Flambeau. In 1989, Tom Malson had a $50,000 bounty put on his head. Tom Malson had to have FBI protection for 2 years because people wanted him dead. Again, it really makes me feel good that these gentlemen are willing to come across the state of Wisconsin and spend time with us. And I know it makes them feel good that they're welcomed by a community and by students that want to learn. And again, it's just been a great, great thing on my part. When we talk about trying to make amends or try to make up for the mistakes that have been done in the past, it doesn't mean you ignore them. But again, I go back to a willingness to listen and a willingness to learn. There's a way to disagree and there's a way not to disagree. And it's something that I think has become a real important part of who I am. And I think my connection to that community has caused me to change my approach in a lot of different ways. And I think it's something that, my parents are very proud of the fact that, I went up, or we've gone up to the reservation many, many times. And let me tell you a quick little story, and then I'll end. I said I grew up in Frederick, and things have kind of come 180 degrees, not full circle. But when I was growing up, there were 2 groups of people that I was petrified of. One was Jehovah's Witnesses. I was petrified of them. And why? Well, when they come up the driveway, my mom would say, "Hide, hide, hide, under the table, under the table." And literally, my mom would tell us to hide, so we'd go underneath the table in the kitchen, and Mom would say, "Shh, don't say anything, shh, shh, shh." And then, shh, like, oh, come on. And I remember being so scared. Oh my God, they're going to come into the house. Shh, shh. And then they were gone. Then they were gone. It's like, oh, okay. And it took me until I think I was in high school and I realized that Jehovah's Witnesses were just people. Okay? We're people like everybody else. But boy, I was petrified. And tell a quick story about that. My oldest brother, Stuart, who passed away in 95, one time he was home by himself, and he used to enjoy being home by himself on Fridays. And this is kind of funny. The Jehovah's Witnesses did stop when Stuart was there, and Stuart invited them in, and we had copies of the Watchtower all over the place and everything. So whenever Stuart was there, they got invited in. And my brother also ordered, I think, 6 gallons of Schwann's ice cream one time too when he was there by himself. But the other group was Native people. Again, growing up in Frederick, to the north on Highway 35, we have the town of Siren, the town of Webster, and Danbury. And Danbury goes through the reservation, the St. Croix Reservation. And when we'd go up to visit my brothers up in Superior when they were in college, so we're talking when I was probably 4th grade or 3rd grade, my dad, when we were driving up, again, he would say, boy, we're driving through the Indian Reservation. I hope we don't have car trouble, because you know what happens on the Indian Reservation. And I remember me and my twin brother being in the back, and my dad would say, oh no, and he'd like kind of go off to the side of the road. I think we're braking. We're like, no. That's what we thought. So that fear was there then. But now, again, if I'm going to have car trouble, I want to have car trouble on a reservation. And I mean that. I mean that. They're just people up in Lac de Flambeau. Our people are people. We want the same things. Okay, we want enough food to eat. We want shelter. We want friends. We want family. We all want the same things. And, and treating one another that way and recognizing that, I think that's a pretty Christian way of thinking, is to listen, to understand, to be empathetic. Again, I hate to harp on that word empathy, but that is a powerful, powerful word. It'll get you a lot of, it'll take you a lot of places if you can do that. So, anybody have any questions? Yes?
I just want to make a comment
Sure.
about empathy.
Sure.
For me, and probably other people, when you're learning about other people someplace, for me it's fiction. If I jump into fiction, I get into this character's head and, oh no, I can suddenly understand. Mm-hmm. And one of the best authors for that, with the Indian issues, is Louise Erdreich.
She's very good. Mm-hmm.
She's incredible.
Sherman Alexie, too, is another very good author. Yep. Mm-hmm. 2 very good authors. A lot of students write book reviews on their work in my First Nations history class. Yep, she's very good. Okay, Mr. Eggers.
Good day, Jeff, and I'll stop. One I told you, young man, we live in the city of Prescott, named after Philander Prescott. Philander Prescott's son died in Indian school. He never forgave himself. His wife did not want him to go. And so Philander actually was killed by the Indians. They said he killed his best friend. The other one is that I first been enamored by the Mayans for 40, 50, 60 years. I've been to 3 or 4 countries to about 20 Mayan ruins. I was led through the Lowell Tomb Caves in Yucatan by a full-blooded Mayan last spring. He showed me that the boulders that the Mayans were trying to block the caves up to keep the Spaniards from coming and killing the wives and the children of the Mayans, because they were not under to the Catholic Church, and the boulders were still stained with blood. Thirdly, it's still happening in Central America today. When I go there, I stay with the family in Latin too. They are descended from Mayan royalty, and it is still happening today. Much of what is happening in our southern border is because of what is happening today in Central America. And the complete lack of knowledge in Central America is horrific by the American people. Find out why they're coming. We can't treat symptoms, we have to treat causes there.
Thank you. I will say this, I forgot to mention this. The ELCA did repudiate the doctrine of discovery. And what I meant to do was to have a bunch of copies for you to take a look at that. And I am so impressed at the work that the ELCA did. They began their work really in 1992 with the 500-year anniversary of the discovery of the New World. And the work that they've done connected to the doctrine of discovery, its repudiation, and their action plan is really, really impressive. And I have to say this too, just being curious, the United Church of Christ is also a leader in discussing and trying to figure out a way to confront this issue. And that's a good thing. That's an impressive thing. So that's something I think to be very proud of. Other Christian churches have kind of intimated their interest, but have not been as so public in the acknowledgement that this is something that we've got to face, as Christian people. So again, that 2016 repudiation statement is great. It's tremendous. Any other questions?
Well, it's kind of more of like a short story, but my dad's grandparents were stuck in the Dakotas once during a blizzard, and they actually would have died without the Indians to help them because they were on a reservation. So my dad always told me that you can't really judge anyone by how they look.
Mm-hmm.
You have to actually get to know them before you can judge them.
So most people are good. Most people are good, regardless of the pigmentation of their skin. Yes, Ms. Hayes.
Just a comment, we were talking about them trying to stop them from speaking their language, and maybe think back to what we learned about World War II and the Mcintosh.
Sure.
I'm glad that we
Right. Yeah, the thing is about, why was the Choctaw language, and the Choctaw kind of get ticked off because they kind of get ignored. The Choctaw were the first code talkers. They say the Navajo, they got all the press. But the Choctaw of World War I and the Navajo of World War II, and there are other tribes too. And the reason being, of course, is because we're talking about languages that weren't written. A written language, of course, is something, there's dictionaries and it's easier to decode. But it goes back to, again, another doctrine of discovery thing, where the belief was if your history is not a written history, it's meaningless. And if you grow up with oral traditions as your history, as Native people did, as indigenous people in the West did, to say that your stories are discounted because they're not written down, that became very problematic, obviously for Native people. But I always like to point this out to students. If you have a way of living that is literally based on oral traditions, literally, when everything's connected to stories and speaking, the only thing you have is your word. And Native people would say to the U.S. government, why are you writing this stuff down? Why are you writing this? Well, you and I are talking. You said you're going to do this. Why are you writing it down? You told me you're going to do it, so I believe you're going to do it. Why are you writing it down? So if you have a way of thinking that is based solely on oral traditions, think about this. Literally, and this is really difficult for us to get our head around, literally, you cannot lie. You can't. You cannot lie. Because if you do, and I don't mean to rhyme, if you lie, people can and will die. You can't lie. And the idea is, well, oral history and written history is more valid. That's kind of the Eurocentric point of view. If it's written down, it's more valid. Well, what if an idiot wrote it down? Yeah. So, the argument is they're both valid. I shot a buck, a 6-point buck, 10 years ago. I think when I told the story this past year, it was a 16-point buck. I still shot a buck, but I just embellished it a little bit. But I still shot a buck. At the core, it's still the same story. So, but yes, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
One of the other realities is under the doctrine of discovery, you really can't win, because the Mayans did have a written language and had volumes of history.
Sure,
which
sure,
the church
sure,
collected,
sure.
And there are very, very few of them.
Right, but it was Mayan language,
Yeah.
right? It was Mayan language, just gibberish.
Wasn't Latin.
That's right, exactly. Yeah.
So you talked about the Lac du Flambeau building being a language school.
Sure.
Can people learn that language like German or?
Yep, yes, yep. The University of Minnesota actually has and I use it a lot. One of the things I do in First Nations class is we'll have students learn about 100 words. Like, you know, hello is bonjour, not bonjour, bonjour. And there's a story about why it's bonjour. They'll learn, you know, mini bashkamin, azagani batus, ijagani bakwazagan. That's blueberry pie. Okay? And they'll learn words like gigawabamin, which means I'll see you. There's no word in goodbye, no word for goodbye in Ojibwa. Just gigawabamin. And there are other languages too that don't have words that translate, but the Ojibwa dictionary at University of Minnesota is tremendous. You can type in a phrase, it will give you the translation, and it has tribal elders who they've been taping over the years say the word so you can hear it. So, yeah, you know, there is a revitalization. Thank goodness there were people who were transcribing or taping some of these elders, because in Lac du Flambeau, as I was saying to somebody earlier, there are no more than a dozen fluent speakers up in Lac du Flambeau. And whenever we go up to Lac du Flambeau, we usually spend time with 2 or 3 of them. And also in Lac du Flambeau, this is another thing that's fascinating, the language. The people on the eastern side of Lac du Flambeau speak a different dialect than those on the western part of Lac du Flambeau. That's interesting. So, yes?
For the school, for like the language, when they were renovating it, did they preserve any of the historical things?
Yes, that's one of the things that when we take the tour, you know, we take a student trip up in October, and then we take that summer trip. And last year we had, who was the youngest person? Do we have a person, 10 and 11 years old, that were on the trip last year? The age range last year, I think, was 10, and Marv, you're what, 51? So 10 to 51, I think. Yeah, so we had the age range. That's one of the things we do. We tour the school. We get to look at some of the things that the students who were there that put in the walls, along with a hat, along with shoes, belt, gloves. It's really sad. Sad. It's a great place. Yeah.
What do you think about the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the possibility of it being transformed?
Okay, it's a great question. If you mention that acronym, let me just tell you this: there's a lot of people on the reservation have that word doesn't represent, the B and the I and the A does not represent Bureau of Indian Affairs for some Native people. So there is a lot of animus still towards that organization, and historically, even without the BIA, the Interior Department has always been identified historically as being among the most corrupt departments in U.S. history. But the BIA, you know, I know people that work in the BIA. I think they do their best. But Native people would say there's not enough Native people within the BIA doing the work for Native people. That's a real tough question for me to answer. The answer is yes. There's always room for improvement when we talk about the BIA. I probably sound like I'm skirting that question, but that's a real complicated question. And what was it, for I think a year and a half, 2 years, you couldn't even get onto the BIA website. Couldn't even get on it because there were so many problems with the administration and money missing and this missing and this. It's been identified as one of those agencies that is a bureaucratic mess. And again, remember, we have 573 Indian tribal nations in the country. 573 separate tribal nations. Okay? That means 573 different cultures and whatever. Yes?
I read something the other day that maybe you could comment on, Jeff. I read that it's about Indian casinos. And there's this kind of idea that a lot of the Indian tribes quite rich because of casinos. And here's the statistic I read, that 10% of the 550 odd tribes have casinos. And of those, 10%, now it's 10%, or 10% of 10%, which is down to 1% are profitable. That means that 99% of the tribes don't have a casino that's profitable. Is that right?
Yeah, that's pretty much true. I mean, the numbers kind of fluctuate, but typically people say, if you look at pure numbers, the number of, again, someone's probably going to look this up and say, you said it was this and it was wrong, so I'm giving approximate numbers. The approximate number of tribal communities that are identified as being revenue rich is around 20 out of 573. And the problem we have here in Prescott is that we are near 2 of them. We are near 2 of them, and we have the impression that that's what all communities are, and it's not even close. And you know, we have 573 tribal nations, but only about half have Class 3 casinos. If a state has an Indian reservation, or if a state does not allow gaming, like the state of Utah, there are reservations in Utah. There's no gaming in Utah because the state does not allow it. So the easiest way for the state of Wisconsin to close down all the Indian casinos in our state is to end the Powerball, because it's the Powerball that opened up the door for Indian casinos in the state of Wisconsin. If a state allows gaming, then that state that has Indian reservations within its boundaries cannot keep a tribal nation from operating casinos. Plus, federal government comes in and says, if you're going to have a casino, you are going to pay the state of Wisconsin money for the exclusive right to operate that casino.
Yeah, well, the reason I asked you is, like in my home state of Montana, there are 2 huge reservations, one for Lock Creek and one for a mixture of nations called Rosebud. And the closest population center to them is 50,000 people. Mm-hmm. Nobody.
Right.
So.
Well, you know, the reservation community in Shakopee, I mean, those tribal members do well. That reservation community has a 99% unemployment rate.
But you kind of have to be near population.
Of course, it's all about location. Look.
And a lot of reservations aren't near any population.
Like Red Cliff.
They're within 25 miles of 3 million people.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what's the moral of the story? Marry someone from that Shakopee reservation. So, any other questions? Again, thank you very, very much. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate you inviting me, and good luck, and God bless.